So let's get to it. What's next for the judicial reforms here in Israel? You know how we roll here, gentlemen. Quick fire round, 30 seconds each to wake up your initial stance, and we pick it up from there. So Douglas Altabef, please take the lead. Your 30 seconds are on.
Sure. Well, look, of course, they're going to have to prioritize the budget because there is a legal restraint on not passing the budget. That doesn't mean that judicial reform is backburnered. It means that there has to be some commonsensical priority. The event last Thursday was a game changer. And what it was both a hug to the nation, a hug to the idea of reform, and a stiffening of the spine of the government to make sure that they follow through and carry out the mandate of the people.
Well, a hug or a bear hug, we will unpack it in a split second. Samuel Hyde, your take.
Well, I think as we reach the point where we're at now, we're not obviously sure exactly which direction it's going to head. But I think what has happened of late is that the actions of the government and the way things have gone have displayed an inherent weakness in the Knesset as a body, as a check on government power. So if we are looking, it's quite clear that over the years there's been support for some form of moderate judicial reform. So it does beg the question as to why the government advanced in the manner in which it did. I think that lives within the 140 other bills that the government tried to pass, that has proposed legislation-wise. But I think that essentially what we need to do is we need to look at strengthening the Knesset and balancing the tension between the branches.
Not necessarily the what, but the how. Gil Hoffman, your thoughts?
I spent time briefing the Moody's credit agency, and they decided not to lower Israel's credit rating, but to put it in purgatory. And by saying that right now it's going down from positive to stable, which means that the government, if it would try to force a reform that the majority of the people don't want, they would lower our credit rating. And if they pass by consensus, then they'll bring us back from stable to positive in the horizon. And that's what Netanyahu is going to try to do. That's what he says he's going to do. And Isaac Herzog can reach the kind of compromise that would enable that to happen.
Yeah, stable never sounded so shaky. Last but not least, Jeremy Saltan, your thoughts?
After 3 months, from January to March, of us seeing the circus that was the Constitution Committee and the Knesset, the entire debate when it comes to the reform went behind closed doors in the president's residence. I think every Israeli should wish luck for the president and the teams of both sides. Yeah, last month over the recess, the main thing was the committees dealing with the budget. That's going to be this month, too. We're not going to see a lot of stuff going through the reforms, particularly because the circus of the Constitution Committee is over and we're behind closed doors. Let's hope that it stays behind closed doors and we don't see constant links to the media and that they're able to come to some sort of conclusion.
Okay, gentlemen, let's feel free to interact from this point onwards. Gil Hoffman, I do want to begin with you and with what Douglas mentioned in his opening remarks, those pro-judicial reform protests we've seen short days ago. Were they for or against Benjamin Netanyahu to an extent? A hug or a bear hug?
That depends on what Netanyahu wants to do, and what he says is not necessarily an indication of what he will do. But right now, it's making. He said in the cabinet today there are different views, and when he said that, I don't know if he was referring to different views among the people or different views within the cabinet. I think that in the end, he will not want to do as extensive or as fast-paced a reform as the people at that protest wanted. He will want to do a much smaller reform that a consensus of people of Israel want, and the justice minister and all the people protesting will have to accept that, because things are different now than they were back then, when Netanyahu just won an election with 64 seats and thought he could get away with anything. Now the polls show 70 seats for the opposition, and against as the candidate that a majority of the people of Israel see as the most fitting candidate to be prime minister, and not Netanyahu. That creates a spirit of him needing to tell his coalition partners that compromise must happen.
Douglas? Yeah. Samuel, please.
Yeah, I think that's super important what Gil's brought up, because there does tend to be this narrative of the will of the people amongst supporters of judicial reform. But I think ever since the government has advanced the reform in the measures which it did, they've consistently, across polls from the left to the right, as well as research institutes, plummeted in the polls, as well as the state is witnessing large protests across the spectrum, but particularly the anti-government protests are 17 weeks in, and there's hundreds of thousands of people. So when this idea that it's the will of the people for the reform, sure, there's support among the vast majority of Israelis for moderate reform, but specifically not in line with the way in which this government has approached it, and that's, as Gil points out, that's clearly evident in the polls and the figures.
A reform, not this reform. Douglas?
Well, I'm not sure that most people who say I'm in favor of reform but not this one could define what it is that they really want. I think it's very clear. I think the Prime Minister has signaled. I think people, I think even Simcha Hoffman has signaled that there will be compromise. There's a prioritization of what needs to be really focused on from the point of view of the reformers. And I think that the judicial election process is the sine qua non of the proposals. And I think you will see a tremendous focus on that going forward. But I don't think that the idea of compromise is that controversial at this point.
Jeremy, what could be a non-controversial compromise at this point in time?
Look, it depends on the issue. We know that the issue the coalition started with of the panel to select judges seems to be the area in which there's the most contention between the opposition and the coalition. But if we are going to go ahead and listen to the voices and really the statements coming out from both coalition and opposition parties when it comes to the other aspects of the judicial reform, we see the gaps are really not that far. I mean, there are gaps, they're definitely there, but they're not so large. They're not at a point that I would say would be too hard to be able to bridge under this month that we have. While the budget is the main issue in the headlines, this is the right time to be able to deal with this stuff while it is sort of on the back burner.
Yeah, before we get to the troubles of the coalition, if you will, on the opposition side of things, Samuel Hyde, if a compromise is reached, does it necessarily mean protests are going to stop?
You know, I think that obviously there's a broad, perspective within the protest, but there's also people from across the spectrum that are there. There's kind of been this rhetoric that that's a group of leftists, which is just not the case. I think what people have maybe failed to reconcile with is that there's something deeper at stake going on here, and that has to do, as I spoke about, the 140 bills proposed by this government. If you look at a lot of them, they're all about instilling ultra-orthodox and religious Zionist values. Proposed prison centers for modest at the Western Wall, gender-separate swimming hours at springs and parks. I think that there is a division that had been brought to the surface by an irresponsible government, but I think that it's a division that has existed within Israeli society. It's congealed among Israeli society, the essence and the fabric of the state, and I think this government has brought that to the surface. Whether or not they will stop when a compromise is reached, I cannot personally say. But I do think that it is important to acknowledge that these arguments go beyond essentially just the particular reform. And if we view it through that lens, well, we're not really understanding the social fabric issue.
Yeah, and to that point, on the flip side, if you will, Gil Hoffman, the budget, the draft bill, the judicial reform, choose your trigger. Bottom line, is Israel destined to go to the polls once again, or in other terms, is another election imminent? Could the coalition survive all these troubles?
Well, I'm not going to make a prediction as to how the government will last, but I can say from past experience is that what's happened is when a government is seen as popular, the parties in it have an interest in initiating elections in order to receive a greater mandate from the people. When a government is seen as weak and unpopular and they're doing poorly in the polls, that makes the parties in it want the current government to last as long as possible. And so that's the way it works in our political system. The worse a government is seen as doing by the polls, the longer it lasts.
Yeah.
And that it bodes well for Netanyahu.
Yeah, the political game theory, if you will. Douglas Altabef, do you think Netanyahu will be posed with an ultimatum of sort from his coalition members?
Look, it may not make great theater, but I find myself in agreement with both what Samuel said and what Gil said. I think Gil hits the nail on the head. There's no motivation to break up this coalition by a Ben-Gvir who may, posture, because he knows that based on the polls, he's not going to return to power. And so I don't think this government is in imminent danger of failing, precisely because of what Gil said, that these guys knows that they're not that popular now, and they have every reason to keep themselves together. As far as what Samuel said, he's right that the anti-reform is not about judicial. It is about deeper issues, existential issues that were opened up, a wound, as it were, or a Pandora's box by these proposals. And I'll tell you, on Thursday night, what I saw was the focus of the pro-reform is just on reform. These are not people who are worried about Israel staying a Jewish state. Of course, it's going to be a Jewish state.
Yeah.
They're worried about not being treated like second-class citizens, that the government follows through with judicial reform.
Yeah.
I think Samuel is right that on the other side of things, there are some deeper issues.
Yeah, you can only run a certain distance from your problem. Jeremy Saltan, in the very short time we have left, 20 seconds, wrap it up for us before we take a break and get back to the conversation.
I remember MK Zouabi from Meretz and MK Ranim from Ra'am not acting as rational actors and toppling the last government. Meretz no longer exists in Knesset. Ra'am is in the opposition. So let's not pretend that every member of the coalition is necessarily a rational actor.
And on that note, gentlemen, we are taking a short break, but we will continue to unpack the current and future state of the Israeli state.